Hey everyone, this is David Pike, the Motorcity Mechanic. Now in today's video, we're continuing with our 5-part video series on removing and replacing the oil pump assembly on a Chrysler 3.2 and 3.6 liter Pentastar engine. Now if you remember in the last episode, part 2, we worked on removing the upper aluminum pan. And at that point, we had access to the oil pump finally. Now in part 3 that you're getting ready to watch, we're going to be dealing with removing that oil pump. We're going to go over some specifics about it. We're going to point out some details, and then we're going to start installing the replacement pump. Now one hand's going to be holding that 3.5 millimeter Allen wrench, and the other one we're going to be using for pushing on that tensioner. Now I can go ahead and insert the Allen partially into the hole on the tensioner body itself. Now we're not going to go all the way yet because remember we got to line it up with the hole on the oil pump. So what we're going to do is we're going to push on that tensioner, then we're going to push in with the Allen wrench and release slightly until we get it to seat in a hole. We will know that we've got it released because we can grab the chain over here and we've got a lot of flex. So now we can go ahead and work on getting the bolt all the way off and then the oil pump gear. Now there's two things I want to mention about this oil pump gear before I take it off. The first one is pay attention to how it is currently. You see this recessed groove? I'm going to come back to that in just a second once I get it off, but that's something important to pay attention to. Now also, if you look around the center portion here, you'll see the smaller holes. What I find that works great for holding that gear, both for installing and removing it, is a pair of needle nose pliers that've got the bent ends on it. Now if I open it up, I can line up a couple holes, I can insert the tool, squeeze it, and now I can hold on to that gear. Now with that tension removed, I can go ahead and back off on that T45 bolt. I don't have to worry about the gear falling off. Now I can grab that gear, I can wiggle it off of the shaft, and then I can kind of drop it and pull it off of the chain. Now the chain's not going to fall because of course the engine is in the vehicle. This one's on the stand, so it's going to want to drop down into the timing cover case. But of course the crankshaft goes through the block. That's where the gear is. It can't drop no further than that. I just have to reach down there and pick it up. But like I said, when you're working overhead, this is just going to hang, just kind of position out of the way. Now when I come back to what I mentioned about that recessed groove, if you look at the other side, the gear is actually smooth. It's flat. So we've got a flat side and we've got a recessed groove side. Now what I've learned while working on different vehicles is I find it both ways. I will take that cover off, look at the gear. I might see the recessed groove facing outward. Others I might see the smooth side facing outward. I've looked in the service information and there is no mention on which way is correct. So what I recommend doing is before you take it off, pay attention to what side you've got. If you need to take a picture of it, so be it. So if the recessed groove is facing outward, install it that way. If you take it off and the flat side is facing outward, install it that way. Now before we can remove the oil pump, we've got to deal with the wiring that goes to it. We've got wiring that comes from the PCM to the side of the block, and also wiring that goes through the side of the block to the oil pump. Now if you're looking on the passenger side or right side of the engine, just above the upper oil pan and towards the front of the timing cover, you're going to find a connector in this location here. On rear-wheel drive vehicles, there would be an alternator right here. Being that this is front-wheel drive, the power steering pump's here, and we've also got a CV axle right here. On the front-wheel drive vehicles, it's going to be best to remove that CV axle assembly. You can still do the repair with it bolted in place, but it's going to be difficult to get to everything you need to, basically because you've also got a subframe that's in the way, not to mention that the CV axle is kind of hindering your view of everything. Now on the front wheel drive vehicles, we're not going to be covering how to remove the CV axle. That's a completely different procedure and a video all in its own. But I want to go ahead and do is unbolt it and sit it to the side. But nonetheless, I do recommend removing it so you can actually see what you're doing. Once you've done it once or twice, you can fight with it and probably get away with not taking it off. But for that first time, if you've never done the procedure on removing the oil pump, I do highly recommend removing the right side CV axle assembly. It has its own mount right here. There's a total of 3 bolts that attach it to the side of the block. And then of course you got everything that you need to take loose at the spindle like any other typical CV axle removal. Now with it out of the way, I can go ahead and point out some important things related to this connector. Now there are a total of 3 different things that we're going to be dealing with when it comes to separating these 2 portions of the connector. The outer portion here that has the harness going to the PCM, all we've got to do is squeeze in on the connector and slide it off. And this has a single stage lock, so there's nothing that we need to slide. All we've got to do is reach over here and squeeze, pull, and set it off to the side. So at this point we'll be dealing with the rest of the connector that goes through the side of the block. Now there are 2 things that keep that in place. We've got the obvious metal clip right here, and also on the same side we've got a plastic finger that comes through that's got a little bit of a ledge or hook on it. Once it comes through the block, it actually is kind of spring loaded to a degree, and it actually catches on the opening on the outside, so even after removing the clip you cannot push it through unless you squeeze in on it. So the next step, we're going to remove the clip. Now when it comes to finding a tool for dealing with that connector on the side of the block, it's really going to depend on, is the vehicle front wheel drive or rear wheel drive? We already know that rear wheel drive vehicles, we've got more room. Front wheel drive, we're fighting different things such as exhaust, we've got some suspension in the way, we've got an axle, items such as that. So in some cases, some long straight needle nose pliers work. In others, you might want one that's got a 90-degree on it. And in some cases, this might not work that well. So you're going to have to dig through your assortment of tools, find something you can get up in there with, because remember, we're taking a metal clip off and we're also squeezing in on the connector and trying to slide it inside the block. So you're really limited on space on certain vehicles. So make sure you take that in consideration when you're starting to select your tools. So I'm going to grab the straight needle nose pliers because I've got a lot more room than you're probably going to have. I'm going to grab it, slide it off. Now I'm going to try my best not to lose this. Now the new replacement pump might come with it, then again it might not. And not just that, you may lose this at some point trying to put it back on, so it's always best to have a backup, even if it came with one. So definitely set this to the side, somewhere where you won't lose it or forget about it. Depending on how long that connector's been in the block and if there's any dust or debris around it, one thing I recommend doing is spraying some WD-40 on there, because it may be difficult, you might have to fight with it, so we need any kind of thing to help us out. So lubing it up with some WD-40 is going to help to actually slide it through. So definitely give it a couple squirts of this. So go ahead and apply some WD-40 all the way around the perimeter. Let it soak in. Now we're going to reach back up in here with whatever tool that'll fit, and we're going to go to that side of the connector that has that finger. As you can see right here, I'm pushing in on the finger, and when I let go it springs back out. So the process is we squeeze it against the body of the connector and at the same time try to push the connector through the block. Now it may take multiple attempts and it's going to be a bit difficult. Now worst case scenario, if for some reason you can't get this finger to stay released or squeezed in place, you might want to try breaking it off. Now that's going to be if we're replacing the pump. Now if we're just taking it off to do a repair, you're going to want to keep that intact. But if we're going to be replacing it, it's going to come with a new one of these. So do whatever you need to do and use your best judgment. So we're going to try to work on squeezing that finger over. At the same time, trying to get the connector to go back in. There we go. And now I can actually push on the outer edge till it goes into the bore and the inside the crankcase. After all those steps, we're finally at the point where we're ready to separate the oil pump from the block. Now I mentioned before about the pickup tube. You could take it off now, or you could take it off with the oil pump and then separate it on the bench. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We'll separate it there. We'll inspect the pickup tube screen to make sure there's no metal, no kind of carbon buildup or anything that could be blocking the screen. And we're also going to replace the O-ring and install it, if it's okay, on the replacement pump. But for now, we've got a total of 4 10mm bolts we need to work on. And we're going to do the same procedure that we did with both pans. Once we get to the last 2 remaining bolts, we're going to support the pump with one hand. That way it doesn't fall down. So go ahead and go to either side of the pump and remove the 2 bolts that are located there. And we don't have to support the pump until we get down to the last 2 bolts. At that point, put your hand up under it. Back off on the last 2 bolts, grab them, and now the pump's loose. We can actually work on removing it. So just lift up on the oil pump and kind of pull the wiring out as you go. Now with the pump on the bench, we're going to go ahead and work on getting that pickup tube off. It's only got a 10mm bolt right here we got to take off. Once we separate it, I'm going to show you the O-ring that needs to be replaced. Just grab a ratchet, cordless tool, whatever you have. Back it off. Then all you got to do is kind of rotate the pump pickup tube till it finally frees up. And there you have it. So grab you either a pick or a flat tip screwdriver and get between the flange and the O-ring and start prying it away from it. Just work your way around until you finally got it off. Now the reason why it's so important to replace this O-ring is the fact that that seals the pickup tube to the pump. This is where the oil enters the system. If there's any leak right here at this flange, you're going to get air. If there's air, we're not going to get the pressure we need. So it's very, very important to make sure to replace that O-ring. And if not, you're going to get low oil pressure, and then you're going to have to take things apart, and you may actually do some damage to the engine if you don't catch it in time. Now that the oil pump's off the engine and sitting on the workbench, I can actually point out a couple key features. Now the first thing is, remember that we've got 4 10mm bolts that bolt the oil pump to the block. Now when you go back with it, this has to be lined up perfectly before you go installing and torquing down those bolts. And the way we do that is, if you look over here to this mounting flange, we've got the 2 holes that the 2 10mm bolts went through on one side. And right here, this little black peg, that's an alignment dowel. And that goes into a recessed hole on the block. Also on the opposite side, we've got the exact same thing. The holes for the 2 10mm bolts and the alignment dowel. So make sure those are fully seated before we go on back with the bolts. Otherwise you could cause some damage or some oil leaks and loss of pressure. Now another thing I want to point out while we've got the oil pump off the vehicle is how we actually release the tension on the chain. Now if you remember, I used a 3.5mm Allen wrench and I inserted it into a hole on this tensioner. Now that hole needs to line up with the hole here on the body of the oil pump. So as I was pushing the tensioner out of the way with one hand, I was inserting that Allen through that hole until it lined up with the hole on the oil pump body. And now the last thing I want to point out on this old pump before we go installing the new pump is this item right here. Now this is the solenoid for the oil pump. This is usually the most common cause for the P06DD code. Now if you follow the blue wires, it goes over to that connector that we had to push through the block earlier. Now this solenoid is not available separately, and it comes with the oil pump assembly. So if you have an issue with that and you're done diagnosing everything and you need to replace it, you're going to be replacing the entire pump. So at this point, we're ready to start getting that oil pickup tube prepped and ready to be installed on the oil pump. As I mentioned before, always make sure you replace the O-ring with a new O-ring. So let's just assume this is a new one. Now before we go installing it, what I recommend doing is getting some wheel bearing grease and coating the O-ring and sliding it onto the end of the pickup tube. So just grab you some of that wheel bearing grease, get the O-ring, and go all the way around the outside edge, making sure that you coat it very well. So grab your O-ring and slide it over the end of that pickup tube. The main thing you want to do is make sure that the O-ring is fully seated all the way around the perimeter. At this point, we're ready to install it on the pump. Now, this next step is very important. Now, if you don't follow it closely, you could cause a problem where you have lack of oil pressure. Now, the pickup tube needs to be lined up with the oil pump. It seems pretty cut and dry. You're just going to insert this into there and tighten down on a bolt. But the problem is the sealing of this O-ring. If you don't make sure that it's fully seated inside the bore of the pump, you're going to get issues where the O-ring gets torn or gets pushed out. When that happens, we have an opening and we have the ability for air to get in there, and at that point we can cause issues such as low oil pressure. So as we're installing this, we're going to pay attention to the O-ring. As we go down with it, we want to make sure that we see it go inside the bore. If the flange doesn't sit flat, then we're going to have a problem with that O-ring. So insert the flange side of the pickup tube into the oil pump housing. And as you're inserting that pickup tube onto the pump, you'll see right there that I've got it pressed against the pump, but it's not fully seated. I can still see the blue on that O-ring. So the technique I recommend doing is actually rotating the pickup tube back and forth while I'm applying pressure towards the pump. and eventually it'll work that O-ring down into the recessed area. And you'll know you've got it because at that point when you release, you'll see that the flange is snug up against the body of the pump. We're going to look around the perimeter to make sure we don't see any kind of blue O-ring sticking out. If we don't, we're good to go, and we'll go ahead and install that 10mm bolt. So make sure the hole on the flange is lined up with the threads on the oil pump. All you got to do is rotate the pickup tube until it does line up. Now you can insert your 10mm. Now for those of you wanting a torque spec for that bolt, it's going to be 106 inch-pounds. Once again, 106 inch-pounds. And I feel the need to clarify, not foot-pounds, inch-pounds. 106 inch-pounds. Go ahead and torque it down until we hear the audible click. Double check. There we go. So up to this point, we've removed the old oil pump, we put it on the workbench, and we pointed out some important things, and we went ahead and prepped the new oil pump to get it ready to be installed. Now in part 4, that pump is getting bolted on, and then we're going to work on cleaning the upper and lower steel pans and prepping them to get them ready to be installed. So if you like this video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up on YouTube. Don't forget you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you got any comments or suggestions about anything you saw in part 3 of this series, make sure to email me at david@motorcitymechanic.com. If you'd like to shop on Amazon, please feel free to use the link that's in the description below this video. Any purchases that you make will help support this channel. Once again, everybody, thanks for watching and stay tuned for part 4.